So, in Canada right now, there's this huge promise that's been made to Indigenous peoples. It's a promise about rights, about reconciliation, and it's even written into law. But what happens when that promise crashes head on into reality? Well, that's the gap we're going to explore. Let's start with this incredible piece by artist Bracken Hanous Corlett. And what he says, it just cuts right to the heart of this whole thing. It's all about these ancient systems of law and ceremony that just keep going no matter what modern legal systems are doing. It's such a powerful reminder that this conversation is about so much more than just government legislation. And that really sets the stage for the central contradiction that frames this entire story. A huge promise, immediately followed by a stark and kind of confusing paradox. Okay, here is the paradox in a nutshell. At the end of 2019, British Columbia passes this law that everyone's hailing as a massive step forward for Indigenous rights. Then, just a few weeks later, you see the RCMP raiding a checkpoint on Wet'suwet'en territory and arresting land defenders. So that's the big question, right? How can a government pass a law that says it's affirming Indigenous rights, while at the very same time, its police force is enforcing an injunction against Indigenous people who are defending their land? It's a real puzzle, and we need to unpack it. To start solving that puzzle, we've got to understand the promise part of this whole equation. So what exactly is this declaration that's at the heart of these new laws? It's called the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP for short. It's a major international human rights document. But the thing to really pay attention to here is the language, minimum standards. This isn't some lofty, aspirational goal. It's the absolute baseline, the fundamental floor for ensuring dignity and survival. And the declaration covers a ton of ground. We're talking about the right for Indigenous peoples to govern themselves, their rights to their traditional lands and resources, the freedom to practice their culture, and the right to decide who belongs to their community. And then there's that last one. That's the one that has become the most debated point of all. Free, prior, and informed consent. You'll hear it called FPIC. The idea itself sounds pretty simple. Before a big project, like a pipeline or a mine, can go ahead on Indigenous lands, the community that's affected has the right to say yes or to say no. This one concept really challenges the old way of doing things, where a consultation often just meant being told about a decision that was already made. And that single idea, the right to say no, well, it helps explain why Canada's journey to adopting this declaration has been so complicated. Yeah, it was anything but a straight line. I mean, just look at this timeline. It shows a pretty dramatic shift. Back in 2007, Canada was actually one of only 4 countries in the world to vote against it. Then, a few years later, they softened their stance, calling it an aspirational document. But the real turning point was 2016, with a pledge of full, unqualified support. And that led directly to BC's groundbreaking law in 2019 and the Federal Act in 2021. It's kind of remarkable when you think about it. In less than a decade, Canada went from being an opponent to a champion of the Declaration, at least on paper. And that on paper part is so key, because turning that promise into a reality has been hit with some enormous hurdles. This is where we get to the other side of our paradox. A lot of it really comes down to this one debate. What does consent actually mean when the rubber hits the road? Government documents talk about striving to achieve consensus, working together in good faith. But a lot of Indigenous leaders and legal experts are pushing back with a pretty direct question. Wait a minute, doesn't consent mean yes or no? So on one side, it's seen as a deeper form of consultation. But on the other, some critics fear it's basically an Indigenous veto over any development. That gap in understanding is a huge hurdle. And that's not all. There are other big challenges. You've got what scholars call domestication, which is just the tricky process of trying to fit this big international law into Canada's own legal system. Then there's the incredibly powerful tool of court injunctions, which corporations have used with almost a 90% success rate to remove land offenders. The pace of change has been called glacial. I mean, the government gave itself 3 years just to come up with a first action plan. And of course, there are very real fears from some non-Indigenous groups about what all this means for the economy and for national sovereignty. And listen to this quote from researcher Shiri Pasternak, because it really hits the nail on the head. She asks, essentially, if this new legislation has any real teeth, if it can't stop corporations from using injunctions to remove people from their own lands, how meaningful can it really be? It just highlights this fear that existing legal tools can just do an end run around the whole declaration. So, how did the government respond to all these massive challenges?
Well, they came up with an equally massive action plan. Just to give you a sense of the scale of this thing, look at this number. This is how many individual actions the plan contains. 181. That's right. The 2023 Federal Action Plan has 181 specific measures to try and line up Canadian law with UNDRIP. And the government itself calls this a generational project. That tells you everything you need to know. This is not a quick fix. This is a slow, methodical overhaul of the entire system.
Which brings us to the final question. Given this massive, long-term project, where do things actually stand now? What does the future of UNDPR in Canada really look like? I think Anishinaabe educator Hayden King offers a really insightful perspective here. He basically says that even if the legal changes take forever to actually happen, the legislation itself has created something new and powerful, a political tool. It gives Indigenous communities a new standard to point to, a new way to hold governments accountable, at least in the court of public opinion. So in the end, what we have is a roadmap for reconciliation, but it's a map that exists inside a system where the state still holds the ultimate power. And closing that gap that we talked about at the very beginning, the gap between the promise of a law and the reality of arrests on the land, that is going to take a huge and sustained amount of political will from everybody involved. And that leaves us here, the Declaration. It provides the words, the framework for a whole new relationship. But as we've seen, words on a page don't always translate to reality on the ground. With the promise and the paradox still existing side by side, the real question for all of us is what will it actually take to finally turn the page?